religious instructions by example as well as by the precept. Pistology says that life educates more than the school, and the center for elementary education is the sympathy of ideas, the speeches, the intelligent activities of well-organized family life. The Hindu joint family furnished the child with his first lessons in the art of cooperation. It is the schooling ground of the social virtues, and in the family life alone, in other words, is there complete provision for what Froebel calls the fundamental needs of childhood, self-expression. The Indian home was not so much a preparation for the school as a supplement to it. The father sitting under the bounteous mango or the shady banyan tree, and the grandmother at her leisure kindled not only the child's love of nature but his interest in literature by telling stories and reading aloud to him extract from the golden deeds of epic heroes and heroines. The child's personality was worked and developed, and his work assessed and appreciated in his treatment of nursery rhymes as well as in the reproduction of these stories. Thus, the Indian family training did not aim at enabling the child to be useful to the family at the earliest possible moment by training him in some practical art, but aimed at harmonious development of his powers. During the pre-colonial period, especially the 17th and 18th century, spheres of Sanskrit literary tradition has evolved through the ages. The home of Guru or Acharya was considered as an institution, but not in the modern sense where people used to live after the Upanayana or initiation ceremony. The teacher would, in place of father, discharge the duties of the guardian who shouldered the responsibility of his ward's maintenance. The people was eligible for admission to the teacher's house only on the basis of moral fitness and unimpeccable conduct. Those who failed to maintain moral values were forbidden to live in gurukuls. The discipline of brahmacharya or the celibacy was compulsory, but married people was entitled to get education on the condition of not admitted as the residential student. Being the residential pupil, he would look to comfort of his guru and worship him like his own father or God. The pupil was to serve the sacred duties, to look after the domestic affairs of the teacher and place devotion in thought, speech, deed, and those who failed had to face disciplinary action in the form of expulsion or debarred from education. Among the Indian caste, the Brahmin or Kayastha mostly dominated educational spheres, especially in the centers of Sanskrit learning. Brahmins were supposed to possess all qualities to have access over the Sanskrit knowledge system, tradition, by the virtue of their birth into the high caste. Before the colonial period, Sanskrit and Persian was the language of elites, and men having knowledge of these two languages used to get high positions in the administration, and they were also earning good livelihood. But in colonial period, people having good command over English used to get clerical jobs in the administration of judicial systems, but no high position was given to any Indian till the second half of 19th century. Kayastha was the one caste that continued to get good position in every regime because they were traditionally educated caste and their livelihood was totally dependent on the knowledge they possessed, because they were not having large portion of land. Duration of stay at the informal centers of learning was dependent on the wish of the master. In the traditional system, the people entered the school at the age of around 6 and leave the school at around 20, depends upon the completion of course. Subjects include basic arithmetic, Sanskrit grammar, logic, rhetoric, art of calligraphy, and other subjects on moral and religious values. Colonial administration claimed to be champions of universal compulsory education or quality education was determined on the basis of job status, which further consolidated the socio-cultural hierarchies. This is also a definition of quality one cannot accept, and lament about the deterioration of this quality have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Michael Dodson has recently noted a growing interest in historicizing the colonial encounter within Sanskrit scholarship, and has attempted to promote and increase awareness of agency of Pandits in responding to and creatively transforming the epistemologies and pedagogies that began to emerge in colonial North India. His work also focuses on the activities of Pandit associated with Banaras Sanskrit College during the time of James Valentine. In her study of Pandits in Banaras, Neeta Kumar has rightly reminded us the Pandits were not homogeneous in their actions and reactions. The problem is therefore not that scholars today are guilty of ignoring or overlooking the contributions of Pandits in the colonial period. Vasudha Dalmia has also commented broadly on the shift in Western attitudes about South Asian knowledge system from a kind of romanticizing mystification to an outright marginalization of bearers of that knowledge, a shift which had begun to set in early as the end of 18th century. Dalmia also takes care to correct for the Western marginalization of indigenous intellectuals by insisting that loss of the Pandit's authority should not be taken to reflect the instinctive worth of their knowledge. Rather, she notes that demotion of Pandit's knowledge was occasioned by the weightage awarded to Western scholarship by the political power it commanded. Brian Hatcher sees these problems which need to be on lookout for, then is not much that of overlooking Pandits as it has been reading Pandits and Pandit activities in a restrictive, dismissive or marginalizing fashion as has so often happened within colonial discourses. That is the goal. One should inquire into the value judgments and preconceptions scholars may have employed as they have thought about the Pandits. In pre-colonial times, when we talk about the historiography on Pandits, Pandits exercise a virtual hegemony over the creation, transmission and exposition of Brahmanical learning. Their schools were the schools for Shastric learning and debate. Their methods were the methods for interpreting Sanskrit literature and for educating matters of Hindu, social, legal and religious practices. Their norms of aesthetic, rhetoric and rational argumentation were the norm that guided playwrights, poets and philosophers. However, the advent of colonial rule in India was to see this situation change rapidly. In less than a century, these Pandits saw the long-cherished preeminence of Sanskrit called into question in sometimes rancorous debate over language and government policy. They watched as familiar patterns of instruction practiced for centuries in village tolls and chatuspatis. Tolls were the primary centers of Sanskrit learning in Bengal, and Chatuspati was also a same kind of Sanskrit-based educational institution. Gave way to new educational institution and foreign curricula. They felt the sting of a European polemic against their cherished philosophies and theologies. They witnessed the dawn of age of printing in India and all that went with it: missionary translation projects, Orientalist scholarship, print journalism, widespread pamphleting, and the dawn of tract-driven social controversies. Taken together, these changes transform existing notion of reason, canon, literature, text, scholarship, and public debate. And yet it would be misleading to imply that Bengal's Pandit merely sat on the sidelines observing all the changes, rather they participated directly in them. Sumathi Ramaswamy, in her essay Sanskrit for the Nation, raises the language question in its relationship to the wider problematic and nationalization of past by focusing on the curious and puzzling status according to Sanskrit in the nationalization of the Indian past in this century. The concern of her work have thus been shaped by three related issues pertaining to language, nationalism, and modernity. The paper also takes its cue from Sheldon Pollock's stimulating essay, The Language of Gods in the World of Men, in which he rightly underscores the urgent need for a social history of Sanskrit. Such a social history, Pollock ought to consider the ideological constraint that from an early period shaped its discourse, chart the changing domain of uses, and learning to hear the new speakers who find a voice in Sanskrit, and above all critically detail what it has meant in history to appropriate Sanskrit. Peter Van der Weer tries to look into the central problematic picture of Sanskrit knowledge system that appears not to take Sanskrit only as a medium of communicating knowledge, but at least in places as a form of thought or a form of knowledge or a cultural form that shapes. This is something that needs clarification and discussion. The advent of modern culture or modernity, which is related to colonialism in India, especially by many It is a well-constructed phenomenon where most of the historical writings implicitly accepts a standard narrative where modernity is associated with many features and characteristics related to socio-cultural practices which was originated in West from 15th to 18th centuries. But when we look into the concept of modernity into the Indian context, most of the historical writings tend to relate it with the instrumentalities of British colonial power and to the influence of Western culture. In the 19th century, or in some parts a little later, a massive epistemological rupture occurrence was seen in the form of gradual replacement of Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian, and also lead to the emergence of serious, complex and highly valued knowledge of English, which led to the shift from natural language to conceptual language. According to Sudipta Kaviraj, the intellectual universe of Sanskrit possessed a culture of energetic, intense, vivid critical discussion, a culture that revealed in the controversy, and precisely because it considered disputation so important in the search for truth, it devoted great attention to devising rules for rational prosecution of intellectual debates. An investigation into the history of Sanskrit literary intellectual traditions of colonial North India will be of help not only to build up a connected literary and intellectual history of land, but also in supplying important materials for the study of its cultural history. This purpose is not, however, served by any study of history of Sanskrit literature as a whole, for necessarily in a general history of literature works that only a local interest cannot receive detailed treatment, howsoever important those works may be in the literary history of a particular province. What is of little importance in Sanskrit literature taken as a whole may be of vital importance with respect to a particular province. The paper seeks to look into some of the relevant and unearthed themes like whether cultural interaction in the realm of knowledge production, early Orientalists learning from Pandits, Maulvis, scholars of Jainism, Buddhism and Sufism, and what these indigenous occupants have learned from them during the first interaction with the outside world. Colonial government made inroads into the Indian socio-cultural structures with the help of early educated Indians who were also the promoters of Western knowledge and used to gain existing pre-colonial administrative cultural structures. And further to concept of identify formation of students of different institutions in relation with the lineage of scholars in terms of sectarian boundaries, with the professionalization of traditional scholarship of Pandits and Maulavis and other intellectuals of different religion. The different nomenclatures for different teachers, munshis and scholars have changed to remain intact with the growth of British colonialism in India. Medium of instruction to the vernacular indigenous institution was also resolved even decades after Macaulay's Minute of 1835, and different nomenclatures for different institutions and individuals like Pandit, Maulavis, teachers, munshis and scholars were of paramount importance for the identity formation as well as deciding the social status. Edwin Garrott tries to explain all the studies of ancient Indian Sanskrit education has emphasized the importance and peculiar character of the teacher-student, which is Guru-Shishya relationship. Indeed, this bond permits the idealism of many present-day Indian social relationship, and it has been blamed in some measure for excessive deference paid to elderly and the important Guru in almost every context, political, religious, colonial and familial. The Guru was always looked up to as a sage and as a master. He expected and received the respect and submission of his pupils, and although the relationship between teacher and pupils was close and intimate, it was not that of equals but more that of father and his children. The Guru charged no fees, but when the course of training was finished, pupils frequently made the Guru a present of jewels, cattle or money as an expression of their gratitude. Someone like Charles Wilkins and Monier Williams even advised colonial administrators and missionaries that the absence of knowledge of any of the spoken languages of India could be compensated for by the learning of Sanskrit. With it, they will at home in every corner of the vast Indian territories. It was the best general language for those destined for an Indian life and would stand them in good stead even if they were ignorant of particular locality in which their lot may be cast. In the first half of 19th century, Two important developments took place, especially in the field of history of education. First was the arrival of English language, as suggested by T.B. Macaulay in 1835. And second was the submission of 3 reports on the status of indigenous education in the districts of Bengal Presidency by William Adam in 1835, 36 and 38. Thomas Munro in Madras has submitted a similar report on the affairs of indigenous education. These reports are quite remarkable documents of colonial inquiry and scrutiny, but also present a complete picture on the status of indigenous education in pre-colonial times, and colonial intervention into the spheres of indigenous setup led to the institutionalization of these centers of informal learning that was very much capable of catering to the needs and demands of local population. According to Pollock, he says that indigenous learning was very much alive in the sense to be made more precise below. When Adam constructed his survey in districts of Bengal, especially in his third report, for example, which contains figure for 5 districts in Bengal Presidency, we find 353 Sanskrit school, 1 teacher per school, enrolling 2555 students. Almost without exception, these students were Brahmins. Vernacular medium schools in Bengal at least appear to have focused on the study of accountancy. The vast majority of Sanskrit students was engaged in the study of grammar, logic or law. Other subjects, among them literature, figure far less prominently. For Joseph Daibona, the Sanskrit schools prepared a large number of professionals such as teachers, lawyers, astrologers, logicians, literature specialists and many more. The students of these schools tended to be Brahmin or Kayastha who required special training to earn a livelihood. For example, there were Puranic schools which was giving education in different Puranas and Vedas, where only the epics such as Mahabharata, Vedas and Puranas were studied. When this had been mastered, the student would go out to the homes where he was invited to recite the couplets he knew in anticipation of appropriate reward. Grammarians are reported to have earned much less than others, while logicians who acquired the most extensive training did better. There were Sanskrit schools for medicine, Vedanta and Tantricism, and others even more than arcane. Compared with this richness, the English schools that were introduced had a fairly uniform curriculum, emphasizing English language and British history and literature. Add to this the age-grade feature of English schools, something absent in the indigenous system, and the lack of fees for many indigenous schools, the English institutions appear less instinctively superior. In the beginning of 19th century, the tolls and pathshalas are the centers of learning for Hindus, linguists in a state of sustained neglect in Bengal, as in other provinces under British rule. The oft-quoted minute of Lord Minto of March 6, 1811 regretted the diminution not only of the number of learned but also of the circle of learning even among those who devoted themselves to it, resulting inevitably in the disuse and even actual loss of many valuable books. The shrinkage of the patronage habitually received in the past from princesses and zamindars, and the impact of social change under foreign rule or the colonial rule, the opening of lucrative employment with a mere smattering of English hastened decay of indigenous centers of learning. The Pandits in the deserted tolls found themselves in the pathetic predicament of the medieval schoolmen of Europe, unconsciously shunted for their pedestal of honor with the dawn of new learning and with the expanding horizons in trade and communication. Classical scholarship stood at crossway. Even the educated natives with a tincture of Western thought, it was an obstinate and shunned in its pitfall. The government with a benign condescendence offered to utilize it as an organ for the slow dissemination of ideas of European literature and science to the people still living under its spell. The Pandits who were not impervious to new truths so long as these were not incompatible with their cherished principles and observation of faith preferred to stand proudly as lone sentinels of forlorn cause rather than their survival or by the conscience or surrender. In his first report of July 1835, William Adam computed a total number of 1,800 tolls for the province of Bengal, on an average of 100 for every district, and the total number of teachers and pupils at around 12,600. Giving education in Vyakarana, which is grammar, including literature and rhetoric, Smriti, Nyaya, were the principal subjects of study, but astronomical works such as and tantras were not entirely ignored. In his second report on 23rd December 1836, Adam noted in the single thana of Nator, 4 schools endowed by Rani Bhavani, who was the local zamindar. Besides 30 were getting endowments from Pandits, whom only 2 were Vaidyas teaching medicine. All these schools had an average of more than 10 students in each. The teachers, living mostly in sordid poverty, found it difficult to keep up their establishments and ran into debt. The students lived under a regime of austerity, and chief expenditure they had to incur was the cost of copying the prescribed dose, which amounted to a sum ranging from rupees 4 to 40 according to the nature of subject studied. In his third report, Adam mentioned around 24 tolls and 153 peoples in the district of Murshidabad, 56 tolls with 393 peoples in Birbhum, and 190 toll and 1358 peoples in the district of Barman. In regions which are now included in Bihar, he mentioned 56 tolls with 214 peoples in Tirhut and 27 tolls with 434 peoples in South Bihar. On an average assessment, the Pandit did not earn more than rupees 5 a month, which was only slightly higher than the normal earning of village Guru Mahasaya, which was this village Sanskrit teacher, with decidedly inferior intellectual attainment. Some of those Pandits were authors of learned works, and Raghunandan Goswami in Vardhaman was the prolific producer of 38 books. Custom of courses set up an order of merit of the different groups to study according to rigorous nature of discipline involved therein. The Nyayikas ranked high in the hierarchies, with the adapts in Smriti and Shabda or general literature occupy the second and third position respectively. But there was very often a cleavage between academic rank and economic output of the Pandit. The gradation was observed on occasion of Vidya, gift or ceremonial occasions. Men belonging to less honored groups occasionally swelled their earning with recitation of Puranas, or more often with the practice of astrology, with the intellectuals always despised as vulgar in spite of its wide popularity. It did not escape the observation of Buchanan, I'm talking about Francis Buchanan, that Pandits who profess no other science are considered as the lowest of all others, and indeed the science is professed and practiced by Shudras. This life of contented poverty was all the more commendable because the educational endowments of land was customarily made in perpetuity of family and convene no obligation on the successors to continue instruction. This second part of this paper deals about one of the important institutions of 19th century called Agra College. I'm just giving a brief study of Agra College because a long paper is a part of chapter which I'm supposed to submit here. Agra College was one of the important centers of Sanskrit learning in general and indigenous learning in particular, which was supported by the endowments of Gangadhar Pandit, who died in 1830, held certain villages in Agra and Aligarh district rent-free under some grant for public and charitable purposes, which lapsed at his death. I'm quoting Agra College just because to give you an example, because in the first half of 19th century, and especially 1857, after the coming of university system in India, before that most of the indigenous education, whether it was established by colonial administration or by the individuals, was mostly getting grants from the individual or charitable contribution. Like Banaras Sanskrit College was funded by the trust maintained by Raja Chet Singh. Calcutta Madarsa and Hogli Madarsa was maintained by the Muhammad Mohsin Trust. So most of the indigenous institutions of 19th century was getting funds from the local elites and zamindars. The formation of Committee of Public Instruction in 1823, it was determined that they would be most beneficially appropriated to the endowment of a college at Agra. And General Committee of Public Instruction was constituted just to take over those endowments, those funds, so that the fund should be taken care by the colonial administration, and it shall fall under the colonial bureaucracy. And the local zamindars and trustees were replaced by colonial administrators. The annual expenditure of Agra College was rupees 16,000 a year, beside the interest of 1,85,666 rupees, which has accumulated since the period of demise of the donor. The main object of Agra College was to give instruction to both Hindu and Muslim communities in Persian, Hindi and Sanskrit, enforcing as far as it was practicable their joint acquirement. There were also Arabic and Sanskrit classes for the pupils who had prior proficiency in Hindi and Persian. The instructions were given in many other important subjects of immense values like arithmetic, European geography, natural philosophy, mathematics, and English. Class was also part of the college proceedings. The following was the list of teachers and distribution of funds and monthly. This is basically a detail about how much teachers were getting, what was the structure of the college, what kind of payment they were getting, and also the list of students and teacher. So Maulvis, head munshis, assistants, arithmetic teacher, a pandit for Sanskrit, a head teacher. So a detailed list based on the archival sources, and also what was the salary of those individuals. सर बहुत लंबा हो जाएगा. प्रिंसिपल की जो सैलरी होती थी, it was 300 per month. I'm talking about 1820s. Head English teacher जो शुरुआत होता है 1830s के बाद, his salary was around 250 per month. Teacher for natural philosophy was 100 rupees per month. Teacher of mathematics was getting 100 rupees per month. Teacher of national history, including geography, was getting 100 rupees per month. Teacher of writing and arithmetic was getting 100 rupees per month. Persian teacher was getting 40 rupees per month, which I think has declined in the 19th century, because in 18th century, if you are having a good knowledge about Persian and Arabic, you were getting higher position in different bureaucratic structures. It's a long thing, so I'm skipping the portion which is related to Agra College. I think when it will be published, you'll be able to read in detail about the Agra College thing. Jonathan Perry gives several examples about defective learning of the Brahmins of Banaras. So now in 19th century, especially second half of 19th century, after the coming of English education, there was in a way, colonial administration started to doubt the intentions of Brahmins and Maulvis, just to replace them by the colonial administration, because till then the colonial administrators, they were fully trained into the spheres of Sanskrit, Persian and other languages. So now they wanted to place. So Banaras Sanskrit College, Kashinath Sharma was the principal, and he was being replaced by James Ballantyne. W.W. Bills, and on the basis of that he was cheating to the institution, and he was involved in the malfunctioning of the funds. So Brahmins reciting sacred texts, and especially priests during rituals, actually have no idea what their utterances mean, and are often reduced to inaudible mumbling or brazening it out with Godel boy cook, in the confident expectation in their patrons will never allow to different. But in contrast to Perry's argument, especially he was saying that most of the people in Banaras were learning from this colonial administrators. But in contrast to Perry's argument, in Europe, I'm talking about late 18th century and early 19th century, men having proper knowledge of the vernacular languages of their colonies were in great demand, and getting jobs in administration and academics was very easy at both in England as well as in India. One can easily see the example of one of the first British Orientalist scholars, H.H. Wilson, who worked at the Banaras Sanskrit College in 1819 and 1820, cited in his application to become Borden professor, which is one of the sought after jobs, on the ground that he had learned Sanskrit from the eminent Pandits of cities of Banaras, and afforded valuable opportunities of improving his knowledge of Sanskrit. The Europeans relied upon the Pandits to gain access to Sanskrit manuscripts and to explain the cultural meaningfulness of Sanskrit literature, as well as to naturalize Orientalist research into the Indian socio-cultural context. Wilson hoped that his Orientalist works would form part of a European revival of Sanskrit literature on behalf of Indians. For example, and Max Muller justified that translation of Vedas was on the ground that it would enhance Europeans' understanding of their own ancient Aryan heritage. George Abraham Grierson was a British linguist and superintendent of Linguistic Survey of India in 1898. During late 19th century, Grierson was asked to visit a school for native boys in the district of in one of the districts of Bihar. As he entered the building, the croaking of the frogs in a neighboring watercourse sounded loud in his ears. Making his way through various passages, he at least came to a long corridor where he was greatly surprised to hear the same sound with extraordinary distinction. The door opened and he stood face to face with a class of Hindu boys repeating their lessons in unison. What a vivid illustration of truth to nature of comparison made 3,000 years ago, and of unchanging character of Indian custom through so vast a period of time. Some knowledge of Sanskrit would thus appear to be an essential element in the training of young men preparing to rule a Hindu population. The reorganization of Calcutta Sanskrit College, which again went through the same process like the Banaras Sanskrit College, where in early 19th century, after the coming of Machiavelli's Minute, colonial administration took overall control of the Calcutta Sanskrit College as well as Calcutta Madrasa. There were many. Calcutta Sanskrit College was attended with salutary effect, but the toll or the Oriental department was overshadowed. There were many who deplored the neglect of traditional methods which had helped to keep alive a stream of learned interpretations and commentaries issuing from some ancient gurus and flowing along a progressive succession of reverent annotations. A new impetus was imparted to the cultivation of Sanskrit on indigenous lines by Mahamukhopadhyay, which means a professor, Mahesh Nayairatna, who opened the title classes in 1881 with 25 students to serve as a model tool run by the hereditary Pandits adhering to traditional interpretation of the sacred text as handed down by the successive gurus. The time-honored practice of conferring title the students by the members of toll gave way to written examination at time, which cannot be exactly determined. By regional association for conducting such examinations, now the informal practice was replaced by the formal setup where examination become one of the important aspects for assessment. But regional association for conducting such examination began to be formed shortly after formal acceptance by the government of the recommendation Mahamahopadhyay Mahesh Nayairatna to introduce a series of title examinations. The Decca Saraswat Samaj showed the way in 1878 and was followed by Bolia Dharma Sabha in 1879 and a similar association with a long English title in Nadia. The Pariksha Samaj was set up under the guidance of Mahamahopadhyay Rakhaldas Nayairatna in Bhatpada. The title had the same invincible glamour as it was in the case of students of English education. The government replaced the old titles like Kavyaratna etc. by the uniform title of Tirtha in 1891. In the same year, Mahesh Nayairatna, the principal of Calcutta Sanskrit College, was deputed by the government to conduct a survey of tolls of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. He accomplished his task by visiting 671 tolls, presented a highly informative report to which we will have occasion to revert later. Now it's a very long paper, so I'm skipping a few of the things. But finally, by 19th century, the colonial administrators and scholars tried to establish a notion of rereading of Vedas, which simply mean that native Pandits and students of Sanskrit were offered only that literature which was translated by colonial administrator instead of original native text, in order to form wider and more enlightened views of Indian literature, history and antiquities. However, even the most confident and learned European Sanskritists themselves would not have denied the fact that they were yet to learn a good deal about the numerous philosophical systems of India in India and nuances of Sanskrit language, because most of them were dependent upon the expertise of Pandits for the true Indian type. In no scenario were the native students and teachers of Sanskrit language and literature compelled to resort to European Orientalist work in order to gain a coherent knowledge of their own religion and philosophy. Here I would like to stop by giving you a brief, say 2 minutes detail about the syllabus of Agra College along with the list of books. There were 4 or 5 important subjects like Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Hindi. So in Arabic, the important books which was part of the syllabus was Mizan, Sarf, Mir, and all of these books are having their origin in pre-colonial times. So Mizan, Sarf, Mir, Hidayatun Nuh, Fasul Akbari, Rafia, Sherah Mullah, Sherah Wakaya. These were the Arabic books. In Persian, Gulistan, which was one of the famous book of medieval India. Ayar Danish, Anwar Shoheli, Hest Behist, Hokat Alamgiri, Abul Fazl, Shahjahanama, Akhlaqi Mushainin, Shahnama, Insha Tahir Wahid, Tawqit Kesara, Shah Nasir Sahuri, Raket Niyamat Khan, Heft Kulzan, Akhlaq Nasiri and Jalali. These are few of them are important source for reading Mughal Indian history. In Sanskrit, again, Laghu Kaumudi, which has its origin in ancient times, Madhya Kaumudi, Siddhant Kaumudi, Manorama, Shabd Kaustav, Raghu Vansha, Magha, Manu, Mitakshara, Vyakarna Tattva. Hindi, Baital Pachishi, one of the important book of 17th century. Singhasan Bhuteshi, Prem Sagar, Rajniti, which is a book on political theory. Braj Vilas, Lal Chandrika, Ramayana. Science, Urdu translation of systems of geographical interpretation. Persian Eclipse, Khulastabul Hisab, which is one of the important texts in Persian for the mathematics. Leelavati, again an Indian text, Hindi text. Hidayah Hikmat, Majmul Shamsi, and English class imparting rudiments of different scientific knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amit, for this very interesting read. I think you stuck to the time very well, 40 minutes. I've made some observation, which I think the best thing to do would be to, conclude with it. Let me open the floor for discussion, and hopefully an engaging discussion. There were some very important and interesting observations that Amit has made, and that could be picked up and debated. Not to forget Sheldon Pollock's work, which is, of course, as we know, very, very debatable. Much critique has happened on it, and it's an important work to really reflect on, to build in a new knowledge of what we understand by the Sanskrit as a language. So, yeah. Ashutosh.
Thank you, Amit. Very good paper. I think you've given lots of details, very interesting details. I mean, I'm curious to know something about these texts which you are mentioning. I mean, is there any history syllabus as well in the university system? Because the Urdu text which you mentioned was all about knowing history of Mughal, even you said. About the Baital Pachisi, Leelavati and Prem Sagar. And these are the texts which are in the syllabus. But what I have found that these texts were also popular in the diaspora communities. For instance, among the indenture, Baital Pachisi was very much popular. I don't know how, what was in it? Why these text was so important that even in the colonial time, they put it in the syllabus. Leelavati and Prem Sagar was also famous in colonies where these Indian laborers were residing. So it's very interesting to know, what these texts are. Why these were very important. It's very.
Amit, would you like to gather some questions? Huh? Anyone else? Janki, you were noting down copiously.
still trying to digest it was a very rich paper with a lot of very interesting information. But I mean, one is I was wondering if one can just ask you to lay out for us, and especially for the non-history students, what exactly your framework is in studying Sanskrit in the colonial period, and what are your conclusions then? Because I'm trying to make sense of, a lot of the literature that you've presented, and it seems to be one of the things which was very significant, I thought, was the idea that actually the Vedas come to be taught through the eyes of the British men who have mastered Sanskrit. And that seemed but was that in all spaces? Was that in particular kind of institutions like that the British ran, or was that also in Agra College and the institutions that were being run by the Zamindar, started whatever, trusts and so on? That's one of the things that I was curious about.
Go ahead.
No, it's a very small question. If you could just elaborate this difference that you're making between dissemination and precept, and how does that really work, and what are the implications of that for your argument?
Amit, mine is a question which is based on what you spoke, because I haven't read your paper. So it may be containing inside your paper, but what you have spoken, based on that I have a question I would like to understand, since your paper may help me understanding on the areas, themes on which I have been working. I do not know. My readings, for example, say of factually one, in 1895, when I was comparing Ambedkar's father pension and the salary of a lecturer in Hindu college, the pension of Ambedkar fathers after retirement, who was a Subedar Major, was ₹50. Whereas the salary of a lecturer in Hindu college was 15 rupees. Then there was another salary of 12 rupees. Then in the schools it was, I'm asking for these details because it helps me to contextualize the knowledge. I'm not purely into the realm of epistemology. मुझे वो डिटेल से, एम्पिरिकल फैक्ट से समाज को समझने में मदद मिलती है, इसलिए मैं वो थॉरो डिटेल्स पे, फिंगर टिप्स पे जाना चाहता हूँ. एक तो ये हो गया कि आप उसमें थोड़ा मुझे क्लैरिफाई करो. क्योंकि आपने जो डेटा दिया है, जो मैं जानना चाह रहा था, वो सैलरी का 300, और वो 1820s में की बात कर रहे हैं, जब मैकाले नहीं आया था. और जब मैकाले आया है उसके बाद 1895 का हिंदू कॉलेज का, दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी का मैं जो डेटा दे रहा हूँ, विच इज ऑन रिकॉर्ड, वो जो मुझे मिला कह रहे हैं. एक तो ये हो गया. दूसरा जो काइंड ऑफ सिलेबस था या पैटर्न था रिक्रूटमेंट का, मुझे उसमें एक दिलचस्पी है कि द रिक्रूटमेंट ऑफ द फैकल्टी इन प्री कॉलोनियल इंडिया, जैसे मिथिला के बारे में कहीं कहीं बहुत हल्का सा, वो सतही तौर पे, मुझे इक्का दुक्का लोगों ने यही तीन मूर्ति के अंदर कुछ पेपर पढ़ा था, तो उसमें बताया था, जैसे उपाध्याय असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर को कहते हैं, महामुखोपाध्याय जैसा आपने कहा कि वो प्रोफेसर को कहते हैं. तो इस तरीके का जो आज हमारा सरनेम हो गया है, एंड इट इज इक्वेटेड विथ ब्राह्मणिज्म, विच इज नॉट. This is basically a thorough secular designation, like assistant professor, associate professor, etc. But this has been made as a sort of designation of Brahmins, something linked with the Brahmanical values or Brahmanical titles, which is not. तो recruitment जैसे जो होता था प्री कॉलोनियल टाइम्स में, उसका क्या तरीका होता था? क्योंकि लोगों ने जो काम किया है इस पर, उस पे कहा था कि जो बुद्धिस्ट मॉन्क्स होते थे नालंदा में, वो साइंटिस्ट भी होते थे, डॉक्टर्स भी, मतलब उनका जो फील्ड होता था, प्लस दे यूज्ड टू बी टीचर्स, जैसे एम्स में होता है। एम्स में वो रिसर्चर भी है, वो प्रोफेसर भी है, वो हर चीज कर रहा है। और उसी का अगर हम प्री कॉलोनियल में जाए बुद्धिस्ट टाइम में, तो उसी के तरीके का एक मिलता जुलता है कि वो रिसर्चर भी है, साइंटिस्ट भी है, पढ़ा भी रहा है, टीचर भी, एवरीथिंग लाइक दैट। व्हाट्स योर रीडिंग, व्हाट इज योर फाइंडिंग? आई वुड लाइक टू नो स्लाइटली मोर इन डिटेल। वी हैव टाइम, अगर कलीग्स बैठना चाहें सुनने के लिए तुम्हें तो।
मैं आपसे ही शुरू करना चाहूंगा, क्योंकि सबसे लास्ट में दो बातें आपने कही। रिक्रूटमेंट का कोई सेट पैटर्न नहीं था, स्पेशली 18th सेंचुरी में, क्योंकि मेरा फील्ड 18-19 सेंचुरी है। उसके पहले का जो डिटेल है वो बहुत ज्यादा फैक्चुअली मेरे पास सोर्सेज नहीं है, बट 18-19 सेंचुरी बेस्ड ऑन दी कॉलोनियल आर्काइव एंड वर्नाकुलर सोर्सेज ऑफ बंगाल एंड बिहार, इतना जरूर बताना चाहूंगा कि रिक्रूटमेंट का दो ही प्रोसेस था। आइदर आपको इनवाइट किया जाता था बाय द लोकल एलिट्स एंड जमींदार्स to give tuition to his son, especially son, sometimes daughters also, but mostly son. और उसमें कई बार आसपास के जो कम्युनिटी के लोग हैं, अगर वो आना चाहते थे, they were free to go. दूसरा होता था कि सपोज मैं संस्कृत नॉलेज, दो तरह के इंस्टीट्यूशंस बेसिकली देखने को मिलते हैं 18th सेंचुरी में, स्पेशली बिफोर द कॉलोनियल इंटरवेंशन। एक था जिसमें सिर्फ और सिर्फ संस्कृत एक इम्पोर्टेंट लैंग्वेज है, वेदाज और शास्त्राज पढ़ाया जा रहा है, पुराण पढ़ाया जा रहा है, और ब्राह्मण ही टीचर होगा। बहुत कम रेफरेंसेस में कायस टीचर होते थे। दूसरा सिस्टम होता था जहां पे कायस डोमिनेट करते थे और दूसरे जाति के लोग भी टीचर हो सकते थे, बट वहां पे संस्कृत इंपॉर्टेंट सब्जेक्ट नहीं होता था। वहां पे इंपॉर्टेंट सब्जेक्ट क्या होता था? वहां पे इंपॉर्टेंट सब्जेक्ट होता था जो आपका डेली रूटीन से जुड़ा हुआ सब्जेक्ट है, लाइक रिकॉर्ड कीपिंग, जमींदारी रिकॉर्ड्स मेंटेनेंस, आर्ट ऑफ कैलीग्राफी, ऐसे सब्जेक्ट्स जहां से कि आपको जॉब मिल सकती थी। और वो जॉब बेसिकली क्रिएशन का सेंटर कहिए या जॉब से जुड़ा हुआ एक तरह से सिलेबस उनका होता था। और उसमें बेसिकली जो हम आज के डेट में बात करते हैं आर्ट एंड अप्रेंटिसशिप की, उस तरह की ही स्किल की ट्रेनिंग बेसिकली दी जाती थी, और वहां पे उसी तरह के सब्जेक्ट्स पढ़ाए जाते थे। सैलरी की जो आप बात की है, वो बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट सब्जेक्ट इसलिए है कि मैं बात कर रहा हूँ 1820s की। ऑब्वियसली मैक्यावले के आने के बाद एंड ऑल्सो इंस्टीट्यूशनलाइजेशन होने के बाद कॉलोनियल इंडिया में, यू विल फाइंड दैट सैलरी डिक्रीज हुआ है। लाइक वी ऑल आर पार्ट ऑफ गवर्नमेंट इंस्टीट्यूशन, सो easily one could see that in Delhi University, say associate professor, assistant professor is getting a started salary of say 85,000, but when you go to Ashoka or Shivnadar or some other private university, you might be getting say 1 lakh rupees or maybe 1,50,000 rupees based on your qualification and CB. So उस वक्त भी सैलरी जो है प्री कॉलोनियल। और दूसरा इंपॉर्टेंट बात ये था कि जो मैं बात कर रहा हूँ प्री कॉलोनियल से मेरा मतलब है प्री 1857, उस वक्त में इनिशियल जो कॉलोनियल पीरियड है, खास करके 1835, 1854 वोट डिस्पैच और 1857 जब यूनिवर्सिटी एजुकेशन इंडिया में आता है, उसके पहले जितने भी, मैंने पहले भी कहा कि एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशन ज्यादातर जो थे वो लोकल इंडाउमेंट्स और ट्रस्ट से मेंटेन हो रहे थे। वहां पे सैलरी का जो क्राइटेरिया है वो ट्रस्ट डिसाइड करता था ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ योर क्वालिफिकेशन, कि आप कितने बड़े ज्ञानी हैं इन द फील्ड ऑफ योर ओन स्टडीज। जब इंस्टीट्यूशनल मैकेनिज्म आया कॉलोनियल पीरियड में, तो कहीं ना कहीं सैलरी का एक स्ट्रक्चर बन जाता है, जिस स्ट्रक्चर में आज हम सब लोग काम करते हैं, और वो फिक्स सैलरी हो जाता है। इसीलिए आप देखेंगे कि ग्राफ जो है सिर्फ सैलरी ही नहीं, आप सिलेबस का भी ग्राफ, जो सिलेबस की मैंने बात की, इट इज ऑल्सो अबाउट आगरा कॉलेज का इनिशियल सिलेबस। इसी तरह का सिलेबस, सेम किताबें, ऑलमोस्ट सेम स्ट्रक्चर आपको देखने को मिलेगा कलकत्ता संस्कृत कॉलेज में भी, बनारस संस्कृत कॉलेज में भी, इवन दिल्ली कॉलेज, इवन अलीगढ़ जो 1857 में बनता है उसमें भी 1875 में बनता है, वहां भी उसी तरीके का आपको सिलेबस देखने को मिलेगा। क्योंकि कहीं ना कहीं अगर आप इंडिजिनस नॉलेज सिस्टम्स की बात करेंगे तो आपको का जो प्री कॉलोनियल एग्जिस्टिंग लिटरेचर है या नॉलेज है वो कहीं ना कहीं कंटिन्यू हो रहा है। उसके साथ साथ आप देखेंगे एक और जो डिबेट सबसे बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट हुआ आफ्टर 1857, जिसके बारे में कृष्ण कुमार भी बात करते हैं, टेक्स्ट बुक डिस्कोर्स, कि टेक्स्ट लैंग्वेज क्या होना चाहिए, मीडियम ऑफ इंस्ट्रक्शन क्या होना चाहिए, इंग्लिश होना चाहिए, वर्नाकुलर होना चाहिए, या दोनों होना चाहिए। थॉमसन का एक्सपेरिमेंट कहीं ना कहीं नॉर्थ वेस्टर्न प्रोविंसेस में इसीलिए हिट हुआ कि थॉमसन ने जो एग्जिस्टिंग इंडिजिनस एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस थे उसी में मॉडिफिकेशंस किए, उसको खत्म नहीं किया। as Janki was asking about my conclusion, this is work in a progress paper, but here I would like to say, in my conclusion at least, that whenever we talk about, say, indigenous education in colonial India, we always say that Britishers आए और उन्होंने पूरा सिस्टम खत्म कर दिया और इंग्लिश हम पे थोप दिया, जबकि ऐसा नहीं है. Through my study, I could easily say that the pre-existing colonial studies continued in 19th century also. Even today also you could see these kind of syllabus, these kind of centers of learning are still there in many parts of the country. And so that is why my whole thesis is based on the historical context of continuity and change. One form of indigenous learning is continuing in 19th century. At the same time, you could see change through colonial intervention. In a way, sometimes historians say that वो hegemonic change था, जबरदस्ती change लाया गया. But मेरा ऐसा मानना नहीं है, क्योंकि वो hegemonic change नहीं था. Either आप उसमें अपने आप को ढाल रहे हैं, change कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि आपको grant भी चाहिए. आज हमें अगर सिलेबस बनाना है तो 70% ही चेंज कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि यूजीसी का फरमान है, ग्रांट नहीं मिलेगा. तो उसी तरीके का मतलब है, ग्रांट साफ साफ है. आप 1854 का वुड डिस्पैच देखिए, उसके बाद के डॉक्यूमेंट्स को देखिए, कॉलोनियल पॉलिसीज को देखिए, तो उसमें यू कुड सी दैट ग्रांट्स विल ओनली बी गिवन ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ हाउ इम्पोर्टेंट इज इंग्लिश एज अ लैंग्वेज ऑफ इंस्ट्रक्शन इन योर इंस्टीट्यूशन. At the same time, और इसीलिए 1860s onwards, you could see that there is a long debate on the textbook and also medium of instruction, and you could find that many of the indigenous institutions, you could see both the set of learning. Vernacular medium of instruction भी है, साथ साथ English medium of instruction भी है. To Geetika's thing, dissemination and precept. Dissemination basically was related to informal centers of learning. You could see that dissemination is always related to the experience of the teacher. कोई fixed syllabus नहीं था, there was no fixed syllabus, there was no fixed curriculum. The teacher was supposed to decide his own curriculum, his own syllabus, and he used to disseminate on the basis of his own experiences. Precept is basically second half of 19th century, जब पूरा institutional mechanism आता है, and you could see that so many changes are taking place into the formal and informal centers of learning. To Ashutosh's question about the syllabus. Obviously, if you are getting funds from the local elites and jamindars and charitable trusts, obviously you would like to continue with the old traditional system. I'm giving you one example which is in a way very funny, that in 1860s there used to be a school inspector ka house, and giving this example on the basis of solid archival document, that school inspector's house was described by the natives of especially northwestern provinces as shaitan ka jhopda, devil's hut, just because they had a fear that agar unke bacche uske aage se guzar gaye तो they would be transformed or change into the Christianity aspect. So people used to fear. That is why Thompson's experiment initially failed in Bengal, just because people were apprehensive about sending their children to the colonial institutions. Although they were also indigenous institutions, but they were getting all kinds of fear, especially Hindus. Muslims were easily sending their children to the Calcutta Madrasa, but initially Hindu community was apprehensive about sending their children to those institutions just because of the fear of Christianity. And also, second thing जो बहुत important है, which you talked about, the बैताल पचीसी और वो जो आप इंडेंचर में देखते हैं, वही प्रोसेस कंटिन्यू हो रहा है. इसलिए मैं बात कर रहा हूँ कंटिन्यूटी और चेंज का ही पीरियड है 19th सेंचुरी भी, स्पेशली इन टर्म्स ऑफ इंडियन एजुकेशन सिस्टम, और खास करके whenever we talk about indigenous education, so you could see some kind of continuity. Even today also you could see numerous institutions, especially informal centers of learning in different villages of India, where you could find that there is only one teacher who is running a small school, having students from nursery to class 5, 6, and giving all kinds of education. There is no fixed syllabus. जो भी हमारे यहाँ, I have also graduated from one of the similar institution in my village called village पाठशाला of say रंजीत गुरुजी, उनका गांव में नाम था ढूना गुरुजी. So ढूना गुरुजी जो उनका पाठशाला जिसको हम कहते हैं, उसमें से I have also graduated from, and there used in my childhood we used to get one important किताब, सर को पता होगा, सर को भी पता होगा, called मनोहर पोथी. Sir, Dhruv sir ko bhi pata hoga. And every children who used to go to that informal center of learning used to read that Manohar Pothi. Manohar Pothi was supposed to be one of the important books to start your initial education. So you can see the similar kind of pattern continuing till today, not only in the colonial period, but continuing till today. Thank you. Or kuch?
A question that, I mean, clearly yes, but what would be the implications of these two different pedagogies for Sanskrit learning? I mean, learning through dissemination and learning through precept, where the exam system then gets institutionalized in the context of precept. So what changes in the learning of the language, culture that Sanskrit embeds within itself?
The main change which we could see that pre-1857, different intellectuals and Orientalist scholars were coming to India, especially to Banaras, to learn Sanskrit. And as I cited the reference of Wilson, that you could easily get good jobs, especially into the fields of academics, if you are being graduated or trained by the Brahmins of Sanskrit or Pandits of Sanskrit institutions of Banaras. But late 19th century, this kind of practices were declining in a way that institutional mechanism, you have a fixed syllabus, you have a fixed pattern, and you have a fixed examination center. So like आज जो हम पढ़ते हैं अपने यहाँ कि ये syllabus है, 8 क्वेश्चन पढ़ लो, आपका काम हो जाएगा. तो फिर वो जो एक दायरा होता है जिसमें आप अनएंडिंग प्रोसेस है, उसमें इंडिजिनस एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस में एंट्री का लेवल तो फिक्स था कि 5-6 साल की उम्र में आपको एंट्री मिल जाएगी, बट पासिंग आउट का कोई फील नहीं था. कई बार जबरदस्ती 30 की उम्र में, देयर आर रेफरेंसेस दैट एट द एज ऑफ 30 स्टूडेंट्स यूज्ड टू गेट पास आउट. डिपेंड्स ऑन कि वो कितना ब्रिलियंट है, कितना शार्प है और कितनी जल्दी वो सारी बातों को सीख जाता है. तो कहीं ना कहीं विद द कमिंग ऑफ से colonial institutional framework, I think the decline could be easily seen, especially in terms of the recognition with Sanskrit or Urdu or Persian or any of the classical or vernacular languages were getting in the pre-colonial period, especially when compared to the late 19th and 20th century.
Can we have another round of discussion, if you so please?
In this system of learning, was there any focus on dietary habits, dietary patterns, or physical regeneration exercises? Because most of these institutions are residential in nature. So to what extent these activities, which could shape the body of a person or his habits, formed part of the learning?
19th century, late 18th and 19th century institutions, especially indigenous institutions, were not residential at all. Pre-colonial times, we had residential institution, and where physical exercises and the other moral and other characteristics were important to the development of child's overall growth. But late 19th century, especially, first educational institution in India was established by Britishers in 1780, which is Calcutta Madrasa. So since Calcutta Madrasa and all the other institutions which followed, which was originated in late 18th and 19th century, they did not have a residential pattern of education. But yes, pre-colonial times, especially in the first half of 18th century, you could see physical exercises, moral values, as well as family values was one of the important attributes to the development of student.
Institutions are not residential. In the teaching learning process, I think there is a lot of emphasis on what people need to eat, how they need to organize themselves throughout the day, and what sort of exercises they need to do. As late as early 20th century, when I read some editorials written by Malviya in Abhyuday, so he begins with a certain explanation of how Indian nationalism should be and what patriotism constitutes, and then goes on to explain how people should breathe and what sort of exercises students should engage in. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on how people need to develop themselves holistically, and not just merely the knowledge of grammar or epics or something of that sort.
Yeah, moral values and physical attributes was one of the important aspects of indigenous institutions, but especially related to the residential school. One thing which I would like to point out here, that indigenous institutions of colonial period basically you were only getting admission, people were getting admission to, say, Calcutta Madrasa or Sanskrit College on the basis of that they were already qualified in their own grammar, on subject, on their own studies before coming to the institution. So people who were already graduated from the indigenous pathshalas or say madrasas were getting admission to those institutions. So आप अगर पहले से ही बहुत तैयार हैं तभी आपको उन institutions में जगह मिलती, because purpose was very clear. They always, colonial administration wanted to train people so that they could be trained in what? Trained in the languages, which is English. So English was one of the important subjects since the early 19th century to all the institutions. And Fort William College was one of the important centers for giving training to colonial administrators so that they would be easily able to understand the society, irrespective of learning the classical languages, which was Persian and Arabic and Sanskrit. They were also in a way training the Indian people, basically Maulvis and Pandits, so that the cultural transaction in the form of language should take place from both sides, initially especially. But after the coming of Macaulay's Minute, things have changed drastically.
What I perceive is that during the early 20th century, there is a fair discourse among the Hindu nationalist leaders where they realize, where they actually lament that with the coming of colonial education, the emphasis on physical regeneration, physical education or physical build-up has actually gone down. And in the changed atmosphere of the colonial period, they keep on hampering this point time and again. कि wrestling करो, अखाड़ा बनाओ, ब्रह्मचर्य का पालन करो.
इसके references
that was the only anti-colonial.
इसके reference colonial archive में तो नहीं.
Very strong actually. So they go on कि भाई पहले के जमाने में तो था, अब खत्म हो गया, बीच में ये 19th century में खत्म हो गया, 18th century में खत्म. हाँ, हाँ. और रेसलिंग पर तो बहुत एम्फेसिस है.
हाँ, बट 19th century colonial archive अगर आप देखेंगे तो इस तरह के रेफरेंसेस मिलते हैं.
तो बहुत एम्फेसिस है. बट
इस
हाँ, जैसे मालवीय वगैरह में तो मैं देखता हूँ कि कब दूध पीना चाहिए, कौन कितना दूध पीना चाहिए, कब खाना चाहिए.
नहीं, वो सब मुझे लगता है कि अर्ली 19th century में जो एक इम्पोर्टेंट इंटेलेक्चुअल थे राजा राममोहन रॉय, उनका एम्फेसिस था ऑन द यूरोपियन साइंस लैंग्वेज एंड इंग्लिश.
राममोहन राय रिप्रेजेंटेड द फर्स्ट जनरेशन ऑफ रिफॉर्मर्स. तो ब्रह्मोस का कंटेक्स्ट बिल्कुल डिफरेंट है, लेकिन आर्यस का कंटेक्स्ट बिल्कुल अलग है, आर्य समाज का कंटेक्स्ट बिल्कुल अलग है. और वहां तक जाते जाते ये चीज, जैसे लाजपत राय के आप यदि लेक्चर सुनेंगे तो वो बार बार ये चीजें आ रही है. मालवीय का लेक्चर सुनेंगे बार बार आ रहा है, श्रद्धानंद का बार बार आ रहा है. बट एक्सेप्ट फॉर द ब्रह्मोस, दैट टू इन द अर्ली पार्ट, टुवर्ड्स द लेट पार्ट ऑफ 19th century.
वो बात तो आ रही है, बट पॉइंट ऑफ रेफरेंस क्या है?
पॉइंट ऑफ रेफरेंस ये है कि वो ये लैमेंट कर रहे हैं कि पहले के जमाने में प्री कोलोनियल एजुकेशन में फिजिकल बिल्डअप पर जोर था.
तो उसका रेफरेंस क्या है, ये इम्पोर्टेंट बात है. क्योंकि गांधी
यही तो हम आपसे जानना चाह रहे हैं कि जो पुराना एजुकेशन है उसमें फिजिकल रीजनरेशन पर कितना जोर है.
18-19th century का जितना भी
टॉल्स की बात कर रहे हैं या जो भी कर रहे हैं,
18-19th century का जितना भी आर्काइव या सोर्सेस है उसमें इस तरह के रेफरेंसेस नहीं देखने को मिलते हैं. ये तो बात है कि उनको ट्रेन किया जा रहा मोरल वैल्यूज में, फिजिकल एट्रीब्यूशंस में, बट किस तरीके से उनको मतलब डिटेल्स नहीं है उसके बारे में, खास करके कॉलोनियल आर्काइव में. गांधी भी इस तरह की, जैसे आप मालवीय की बात करें, गांधी भी सेकेंड राउंड टेबल कॉन्फ्रेंस में बात करते हैं कि इंडिया जो है वो उसका लिटरेसी रेट काफी कम हुआ 19th century में कंपेयर टू 18th century और 17th century. और उनका बहुत लंबा डिबेट चलता है वहां पे लंदन में, और उनसे पॉइंट ऑफ रेफरेंस पूछा जाता है कि आप कहाँ से ये बात कह रहे हैं. तो उस पे वो कहते हैं कि मैं आपको रेफरेंस दूंगा, बट वहां पे उनसे ये बार बार चिट्ठी लिखी जाए, उसके बाद वापस आते हैं और जेल चले जाते हैं. वो जिन जनाब के साथ उनकी डिबेट चलती है वो बार बार उनसे पूछते हैं कि आप मुझे बताइए किस बेसिस पे आपने ये बात कही. तो गांधी उनको एक आध उस जमाने के हिस्टोरियंस का नाम देते हैं और कहते हैं कि आप उनसे बात कर लीजिए. बट उससे भी वो सेटिस्फाई नहीं होते हैं और फिर भी वो पूछते हैं कि आप बताइए कि कहाँ से आप ऐसी बात कर रहे हैं. तो गांधी फिर उनको एग्जाम्पल देते हैं विलियम एडम की तीनों रिपोर्ट्स का, जिसमें एडम्स बात करते हैं लिटरेसी रेट की, एडम्स बात करते हैं इंपॉर्टेंस ऑफ इंडिजिनस एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशंस की, और फिर वो उस रेफरेंसेस के बिना पे भी बात लेकिन वहां पे खत्म नहीं होती है, कहीं ना कहीं वो बात चलती रहती है. और इसीलिए बाद में धर्मपाल ने भी जब उन तीनों रिपोर्ट्स को एडिट किया तो कहते हैं कि इंडिया वॉज अ ब्यूटीफुल ट्री बिफोर कमिंग टू दी कॉलोनियल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन. इसीलिए। और डायबोना ने बाद में उसी को वन टीचर वन स्कूल का नाम दिया कि वो जो इंस्टीट्यूशन विलेज पाठशाला या टोल्स थे बंगाल में, वो वन टीचर बेस्ड इंस्टीट्यूशन थे और बहुत जो इम्पोर्टेंट तरीका ये था कि लोकल नीड्स एंड डिमांड्स को केटर करते थे। तो गांधी का तो रेफरेंसिंग मुझे पता था कि वो विलियम एडम को कोट कर रहे हैं, बट जिस तरह से आप मालवीय का जिक्र कर रहे हैं या बाकी आर्य समाजियों की बात कर रहे हैं, बात तो वो करते हैं बट पॉइंट ऑफ रेफरेंस कहते हैं मतलब पुराने जमाने में ऐसा रहा होगा, लेकिन 19th सेंचुरी कॉलोनियल पीरियड में इस तरह के रेफरेंसेस देखने को नहीं मिलते हैं।
वो तो ये कह रहे हैं कि कॉलोनियल पीरियड में ही खत्म हो गया। इनफैक्ट जो मालवीय का प्रोस्पेक्टस है बीएचयू का, जो 1905 में छपा पहली बार और सनातनिस्ट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में उसको रखा भी गया और पास भी हुआ, उसका एक चैप्टर ही इसी पर है, फिजिकल रिजनरेशन पर, और वो बहुत प्रोमिनेंट है, इन विच मालवीय कीप्स ऑन सेइंग कि जो डिसेंशियल सेंससेस शुरू हुए हैं तो हिंदुओं की संख्या घट रही है, और उसका ये बहुत बड़ा कारण है कि फिजिकली हम वीक हो रहे हैं, आवर लिम्स आर बिकमिंग वीक, तो उसके क्या क्या उपाय होने चाहिए। और वो काफी स्ट्रॉन्ग डिस्कोर्स, धीरे धीरे जब वो बीएस मुंजे तक जाता है, सावरकर तक जाता है, तो बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग डिस्कोर्स हो जाता है। यहाँ पे एक माइल्ड डिस्कोर्स है, बाकी जाकर के वो बहुत एग्रेसिव डिस्कोर्स है।
अमित की जो 1817 में 1820 में अगर वाइंड अप कर सकते हैं अगर हम लोग थक रहे हैं तो। ये जो डिफरेंट रिपोर्ट्स आ रहे हैं ब्रिटिश एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर्स के ऑन द इंडियन एजुकेशन, सोनाली चितालकर ने इसका जिक्र किया, मिरांडा में पढ़ाती है, उसका एक चैप्टर है एडुकेशन के ऊपर में, 2 चैप्टर्स उसने अलग अलग लिखे हैं, तो वो कहीं जिक्र करी, वो एग्जैक्ट रिपोर्ट का टाइटल मेरे जहन में भी तुरंत नहीं आ रहा है, बट रेफरिंग टू हर वर्क्स चैप्टर्स इन द बुक, वो है कि 1820-1817 के आसपास में ब्रिटिश एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर्स के जो रिपोर्ट आ रहे हैं, उस रिपोर्ट को देखने पे ये लग रहा है कि द एडुकेशन इन प्री कॉलोनियल इंडिया वाज फार अहेड ऑफ द एडुकेशन इन ब्रिटेन इटसेल्फ, नंबर 1। और दूसरा है कि मैं जानना चाहता हूं उसको साइट करने का कि अगर उसको पढ़ा है आपने तो उसमें क्या डिटेल्स क्या है, कुछ अगर वो उससे सहूलियत हो सकती है।
सबसे पहले तो 1816-17 में कोई रिपोर्ट नहीं आई है, पहली जो कंक्लूसिव रिपोर्ट आई वो 1835 में आई है। एक तरफ मैक्यावले का एक्सपेरिमेंट आ रहा है इंडिया में रिलेटेड टू द इंग्लिश एजुकेशन, एंड दूसरी तरफ बिफोर द इंट्रोडक्शन ऑफ मैक्यावले's मिनट और द इंग्लिश एज एन इम्पोर्टेंट सब्जेक्ट और मीडियम ऑफ इंस्ट्रक्शन, विलियम एडम्स का रिपोर्ट बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट जस्ट टू नो अबाउट द कंडीशन ऑफ इंडिजिनस सेंटर्स ऑफ लर्निंग, स्पेशली इन द बंगाल प्रेसिडेंसी एंड बिहार का सम पार्ट्स। 1835 में पहली रिपोर्ट पब्लिश होती है, सबमिट होती है बेसिकली, 36 में दूसरी और 38 में तीसरी। उसके पहले जो भी पॉलिसीज रही हैं, वो पहली पॉलिसी रिगार्डिंग इंडियन एजुकेशन अगर हम कहें तो 1813 चार्टर एक्ट है, जिसमें सिर्फ इतना बात है कि 1 लाख रुपया आपको एनुअल मेंटेनेंस के लिए मिलेगा एजुकेशन का, बट वो उसके बारे में मैंने बहुत डिटेल रिसर्च करने की कोशिश की थी, कहीं नहीं मिला कि वो 1 लाख रुपया कहाँ इन्वेस्ट हुआ। सिर्फ इतना था कि 1 लाख रुपया एनुअली है, बट उसका ऑन पेपर तो था, बट उसके इन प्रैक्टिस उसका जो इम्प्लीकेशन या उसका जो यूज हो सकता था वो नहीं मिलता है। हाँ वो नहीं, हाँ चार्टर एक्ट में उसका बहुत क्लियर मेंशन है और करते हैं। उसके बाद जो दूसरा एफर्ट इन टर्म्स ऑफ कॉलोनियल पॉलिसी देखने को मिलता है वो मिलता है 1823 में, जब जनरल कमेटी ऑफ पब्लिक इंस्ट्रक्शन बनता है और उनको ये जिम्मेदारी दी जाती है कि आप इस तरह का 1-2 काम होता है। एक तो कि जितने भी इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं कॉलोनियल फ्रेमवर्क में उसको सुपरविजन आप करें, एंड दूसरा फंडिंग का जो मसला है, जैसे मैंने कहा कि जो ट्रस्ट के मेंटेन लोग थे या इंस्टीट्यूशंस थे या कम्युनिटी मेंटेन इंस्टीट्यूशंस थे, उसको अपने कंट्रोल में ले लो, क्योंकि अगर आपको ग्रांट चाहिए तो यू नीड टू कम टू द ब्रॉडर अम्ब्रेला ऑफ कॉलोनियल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन। ये दूसरा पक्ष था जब कॉलोनियल आपको डॉक्यूमेंट्स या पॉलिसीज के थ्रू समझने एजुकेशन के बारे में जिक्र होता है। तीसरा फिर 1835 भी है, इन बिटवीन इंस्टीट्यूशंस खुले हैं। 1780 कैलकटा मदरसा आता है, 1784 में एशियाटिक सोसाइटी आता है, 1791 बनारस संस्कृत कॉलेज आता है, 1800 पोर्ट विलियम कॉलेज आता है, 1817 संस्कृत कॉलेज खुलते खुलते रह जाता है बिकॉज ऑफ राजा राम मोहन रॉय's इंटरवेंशन, जो ये कहते हैं कि इफ यू वांट टू सीरियसली एजुकेट अस प्लीज गिव अस एजुकेशन इन यूरोपियन साइंसेज, यूरोपियन लैंग्वेज एंड स्पेशली इंग्लिश। और उनके अपोजिशन की वजह से संस्कृत कॉलेज खुलने के बजाय हिंदू कॉलेज खुलता है 1817 में। बट अगेन 1825 उसको खोला जाता है संस्कृत कॉलेज को, क्योंकि कहीं ना कहीं इट वाज इन अ वे रिलेटेड टू द अपीजमेंट पॉलिसी ऑफ लोकल कम्युनिटीज। जहां पे जो कम्युनिटी डोमिनेट कर रही है, कलकत्ता में मुस्लिम डोमिनेट कर रहे हैं तो कलकत्ता मदरसा खोल दो, बनारस में हिंदू स्पेशली ब्राह्मणिकल डोमिनेंस है तो संस्कृत कॉलेज खोल दो। और ये बहुत, फिर अगर ये भी लग रहा है साथ साथ कि कलकत्ता में मदरसा खोला तो हिंदू कम्युनिटी नाराज ना हो जाए तो अगेन संस्कृत कॉलेज खोल दो। इन अ वे ये अपीजमेंट पॉलिसी का ही एक हिस्सा था। बट जो सीरियस एफर्ट हुआ एजुकेशन में, खास करके इन टर्म्स ऑफ पॉलिसीज, वो 1835 ऑनवर्ड्स ही शुरू होता है। और उसके बाद 1854 में वुड्स डिस्पैच है, उसके पहले 1842 में मिंटो का रिफॉर्म है, थॉमसन का एक्सपेरिमेंट है बंगाल में, 1854 वुड्स डिस्पैच है, एंड फाइनली 1857 में जब यूनिवर्सिटी एजुकेशन आता है। तो 1857 अपने आप में एक लैंडमार्क पीरियड है। उसमें दो चीजों के बारे में ज्यादातर लोग बात करते हैं, विच इज 1857 रेवोल्यूशन, रिवोल्ट, जो भी उसके बारे में बात करें। 54 हाँ। नहीं, यूनिवर्सिटीज के खोलने का सिर्फ इतना मकसद था, उसको रीऑर्गेनाइज करके एग्जामिनेशन, डिग्री और इन अ वे एक माने इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क में लाना है। उसके पीछे का भी यही मसला था कि कहीं ना कहीं कॉलोनियल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन 1857 से खर्च के अलावा एक और पॉलिसी थी कि हम डायरेक्ट इनरोड्स नहीं कर सकते, डायरेक्ट चेंज करेंगे तो शायद फिर 1857 जैसा कोई रिवोल्ट हो जाए। तो कहीं ना कहीं उस डर से भी वो एक्सपेरिमेंट कर रहे हैं, बट धीरे धीरे कर रहे हैं। पहला यूनिवर्सिटी एजुकेशन लाया, सिस्टम लाया बेसिकली टू सुपरवाइज द एग्जामिनेशन एंड गिविंग डिग्रीज एंड ऑल। फिर 1860s में बेसिकली डिस्कोर्स लैंग्वेज का शुरू होता है। मीडियम ऑफ इंस्ट्रक्शन क्या होगा, वर्नाकुलर होगा या आपका इंग्लिश होगा या क्या होगा, क्लासिकल भी साथ। तो तीन तरह के इंस्टीट्यूशन देखने को मिलते हैं, जहां एक तरफ इंडिजिनस एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं जो क्लासिकल ट्रेनिंग के लिए जाने जा रहे हैं, उर्दू, पर्शियन, अरबिक, संस्कृत। दूसरी तरफ वर्नाकुलर मीडियम, बंगाली मीडियम स्कूल दिखेगा आपको, तहसीली स्कूल्स नॉर्थ वेस्टर्न प्रोविंसेस में दिखते हैं, जमींदारी स्कूल्स दिखते हैं, हल्कबंदी स्कूल्स दिखते हैं, बहुत सारे एक्सपेरिमेंट्स हैं। और उसके बाद तीसरा क्या है, तो मिशनरी इंटरप्राइजेस भी चल रहे हैं, जहां इंग्लिश एजुकेशन एक इंपॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट है। बट इन दोनों इंस्टीट्यूशंस में भी, वर्नाकुलर हो या क्लासिकल हो, आपको इंग्लिश एक इंपॉर्टेंट सब्जेक्ट रखना पड़ेगा, लैंग्वेज रखना पड़ेगा, अदरवाइज ग्रांट नहीं मिलेगा। 1882 ऑनवर्ड्स, हंटर कमीशन की रिपोर्ट के बाद कहीं ना कहीं थोड़ा और सिस्टमेटाइज एजुकेशन जो इंडिया में है उसकी प्रैक्टिसेस शुरू होती हैं। बट 1882 के पहले तक कहीं ना कहीं हर तरह के फॉर्म्स ऑफ एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशंस आपको देखने को मिलेंगे। ये 1857 के वक्त में ऐसा हुआ है। 1857 में कलकत्ता मदरसा, जो कि आज भी आलिया यूनिवर्सिटी के नाम से चल रही है, कंटिन्यू कर रही है, कलकत्ता मदरसा का ओरिएंटल डिपार्टमेंट को बंद कर दिया गया था 1857 के बाद, कि उनको लगता था कि न्यूटनी में या जो चीजें अभी हुई हैं उसमें उनका रोल बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट रहा, मौलवियों का। और मौलवियों ने खास करके भड़काया है लोकल कम्युनिटीज को ब्रिटिश हुकूमत के खिलाफ। ये एक इंपॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट था। बट आप ये देखें कि इट इज नॉट ओनली इन से नीट 19th सेंचुरी और से 20th सेंचुरी, दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी का एग्जाम्पल आप दे रहे हैं। कलकत्ता मदरसा जब खुलता है 1780 में, तो पहले 3 साल वॉरेन हेस्टिंग्स को अपने पॉकेट से चलाना पड़ता है इंस्टीट्यूशन का। 1883 में जस्ट बिकॉज मोहम्मद मोहसिन ट्रस्ट काफी इंपॉर्टेंट ट्रस्ट था, हुगली कॉलेज उसके बेसिस पे चल रहा था, और बहुत बड़ा लैंड जागीर मरियम जहान बेगम छोड़ के जाती हैं, जिनके भाई होते हैं मौलाना मोहम्मद मोहसिन, हाजी मोहम्मद मोहसिन। मोहम्मद मोहसिन का जो एजुकेशनल ट्रस्ट है, क्योंकि मोहसिन की डेथ हो जाती है 1812-13 के आसपास, उसके बाद वो पूरा ट्रस्ट में तब्दील हो जाता है। इन बिटवीन जब तक वो जिंदा थे तब भी जो भी खास करके मदरसास थे वहां पे, चाहे वो इंग्लिश से कॉलोनियल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ने शुरू किए हों या लोग अपने इंडोमेंट से चला रहे हों, 3 इंपॉर्टेंट मदरसा थे उस जमाने में, डेक्का मदरसा, चिटगांव मदरसा, हुगली मदरसा, और बाद में कलकत्ता मदरसा चौथा मदरसा बना, जो चारों मदरसे कहीं ना कहीं उसी ट्रस्ट के मेंटेनेंस से चलते थे। तो ट्रस्ट का मेंटेनेंस जब आता है तो एनुअल एक्सपेंडिचर 65,000 हो जाता है। जो आप कह रहे हैं 40,000 है 1922 में दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी का, वो 65,000 होता है कलकत्ता मदरसा का 1781-82 के आसपास, 1803 ऑनवर्ड्स जब वो छोड़ देते हैं वॉरेन हेस्टिंग्स। शुरू में वो जब शुरू होता है तो एक छोटे से कमरे में शुरू होता है, और बाद में बॉय बाजार एक बहुत बड़ा सेंटर है कलकत्ता का आज भी, वो बाजार में वो जब शिफ्ट करता है तो बड़ी बिल्डिंग बनती है। मेरे पास फोटोज हैं लैपटॉप पे, अगर ये हो चलता तो मैं दिखा पाता। ये सारी चीजें फेज वाइज चेंज होती रहती हैं, और मेरी जो प्रपोज बुक है शायद उसमें ये सारी चीजें और डिटेल में आएंगी, जिसमें एक चैप्टर कलकत्ता मदरसा पे है, एक चैप्टर बनारस संस्कृत कॉलेज पे है, एक चैप्टर क्रिश्चियन मिशनरी एजुकेशन पे है, एक चैप्टर इनफॉर्मल सेंटर्स ऑफ लर्निंग पे है, जहाँ पे महल कवल्दी, तहसीली, जमींदारी, जागीरदारी, इस तरह के जो स्कूल्स रहे हैं उसके बारे में भी जिक्र करता हूँ। इनफॉर्मल सेंटर 1, टीचर 1 स्कूल की भी बात करता हूँ, और बाकी की पॉलिसीज पे 2 चैप्टर हैं। तो वो जब आएगी इन फ्यूचर तो आप लोगों को ज्यादा डिटेल उसमें देखने को मिलेगा। मिशनरी ऑब्वियसली इनिशियली कम्युनिटी स्पॉन्सरशिप था, बाद में हाँ इनिशियली उनका जो मिशनरी इंटरप्राइज चर्च के थ्रू मेंटेन होता था, बाद में फिर वो कॉलोनियल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन का पार्ट बना।
Good. I think we've had a very healthy discussion. In fact, I had a few points to say, but anyway, ignore that. What I was very curious is the character you mentioned, Monier Williams, and he contested with Max Muller to get the seat, the chair in Oxford University. Now, why I'm saying this is because my own research into the canal history during that time, during the colonial time. He writes a very interesting letter to the editor in the Times in 1871, Monier Williams, saying that probably it's the canals which will overturn the impression of the British Raj in India from being unjust to just. And that's how he, sort of glorifies the whole action. But more importantly, Amit, in his book which you mentioned, he actually looks ahead and almost constructs a complete and a systematic demolition of Sanskrit as a complete language. He says that the decline of Hindu, the rise of Islam, and therefore then the missionary intersection. So the whole Sanskrit as a complete knowledge, and this is a space probably you would like to investigate. How has it been systematically destroyed by the British? Their policies, the institutions that came about. And therefore today when we talk about this language in terms of revivalism, then the contemporariness of history comes into play. It's just something to reflect upon. Thank you very much for coming, and an interesting paper. I don't know whether tea is served or not, I don't know, but if it is,